So just so everyone is aware, we are recording this session so that we can share it with others who are interested but not able to be here right at this moment. And I'm Rabbi Bonnie Koppel, Associate Rabbi of Temple Chai. Deeply grateful to my beloved friend, Dr. Alan Molk, who is the one who brought Rochy Miller to us and suggested this program. We are observing tonight Yom haShoah v'Hagvura, and I'm very attracted to the Israeli way of stating the name of this observance. We in America often speak about Yom haShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day, but in Israel, this day is called Yom haShoah v'Hagvura, the day in which we commemorate the Holocaust and also the strength, the resistance, the courage. So we focus not only on the intensely, unspeakably horrible events of the Shoah, but also the incredible acts of courage that were part of that experience as well. I am going to turn it over to Dr. Molk, who will be introducing his colleague, our speaker. I'll ask you to please hold your questions until the end of the presentation. And at the end of the presentation, as long as Dr. Miller is available, we will continue to have conversation. So with that, everyone please settle in, give your attention to Dr. Molk and Dr. Miller.
Okay, thank you so much, Rabbi Koppel. It is my immense pleasure to introduce Dr. Rochy Miller. Miller's a married name, Leibowitz was a maiden name. And I go back a long time with Rochy. She and a wonderful husband, Jonathan, we were all in medical school together in Johannesburg, South Africa. And, you know, we reconnected after many years, and it's like we were like old friends like we were during our medical school days. Here we are 45 years later. Rochy is a remarkable woman, not only with a medical degree, she's also a gifted artist. You can look her up on Facebook. But most significantly for tonight's purpose, she wrote this incredible book called Not Just a Survivor, about her mother who was in the Holocaust. The book is utterly remarkable, and it has already made some impact, even though it's only been out for a short period of time. For example, Rochy and her daughter, who happens to also live in Florida, did a presentation about the book that was facilitated by the Holocaust Education Center in Florida, a 3-generation experience. Following this, with the help of some donors who were very touched with the book is now being considered to be used for the development of Holocaust curriculum education in Florida high schools. How amazing and phenomenal is that? In addition, in Australia, she's become part of an organization called the Upstanders program from the same Holocaust Education Center. And this is a program in Australia where she is telling her story in person. In Australia, the program is called Courage to Care, where the experiences of the Holocaust survivors are used as a springboard to initiate discussion around transforming people from being a bystander to an upstander. Utterly amazing. And so without further ado, live from Brisbane, Australia, I give you my friend and colleague, Rochy Miller. Take it away, Rochy.
Thank you. Thank you, Ellen. So, good day from Australia, everybody. At this moment in time, you and I are on different continents, in different countries, on different days, and in different time zones. Today in Australia is already Yom haShoah. Today, when we remember all the victims of the Holocaust, there are so many amazing people that could be talking to you. Historians, educators, Shoah survivors, of whom there are many in your country and in your state. So why am I here? I'm here to talk to you about a remarkable woman, somebody whose normal life was totally decimated for the years between 22nd of June 1941, when she was incarcerated first in the Kovno ghetto and then in 5 concentration camps in Estonia and Germany, until she was liberated on the 15th of April 1945 from Bergen-Belsen. But what I want to focus on today is not the horror of that time, nor the terrible devastation and loss that she suffered, but her bravery, her humanity, and her optimism that helped her to survive and allowed her to emerge from that dark period as a whole, accomplished, exemplary human being. Someone who went on to dedicate her life to perpetuating the memory of the Holocaust, to educating everyone she could, and to ensuring that the lessons of that time would never be forgotten. She was simply an incredible person, and I was privileged to have her as my mother. Every day of my life, but especially on this day, I remember my mother, Lea Charif, and I remember her stories. I'm reminded of her life before the Holocaust, the incomprehensible trauma she went through as a Jew in Lithuania during the Holocaust, and her qualities and strengths that enabled her to live a full and complete life after the Holocaust. It was my mother's mission throughout her life to make sure that everyone she met knew her story. She felt an obligation to share her story in the hope that by sharing her experiences, people would be better equipped to prevent such an atrocity from ever happening again. My mother passed away in 2000, and the importance of telling her story has passed to me and my children, especially my daughter, Kerry. We both share my mother's mission and sense of obligation to ensure that her story continues to be heard. From a personal perspective, I love talking about her. I love to reminisce about who she was, to recall her wonderful attributes and her quirks, and to consider what an amazing influence she's been on my life. But this year, talking about her past feels even more important and significant, more urgent, more universal. Knowing the impact that COVID has had on our Holocaust survivors, accelerating the inevitable loss of these vulnerable and precious remaining witnesses to the Shoah, I feel like I've finally stepped up and acknowledged this moral obligation that I, as a direct descendant of a Holocaust survivor, bear. It's time now, more than ever, for me and other second and third generation survivors to take responsibility to ensure the continuity of our past and our future. If we do not share the Holocaust stories of our parents and grandparents, then their stories will end with us. We need to be their voices, especially when so many can no longer share their testimonies. In our current climate of increasing racism, anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, raising awareness and education is critical. And we have a next generation obligation to the victims of the Shoah to do everything in our power to ensure that this atrocity never happens again, anywhere in the world. And so today I'm grateful and honored to have been given this opportunity to share with you my mother's story. Let me tell you a little bit about me. My name is Rochy Miller. I was born in South Africa. I live in Australia. I emigrated there in 1991, and I live there with my husband. I have 2 married children, one of whom lives in Australia, the other lives in Florida with her husband and my 2 gorgeous granddaughters. I'm a retired medical doctor, and I have a degree in journalism. And I recently published a book called Not Just a Survivor, A Portrait of My Mother, which is a memoir of my mother's life. My mother, Lea, was born in Lithuania in 1914. From the outset, by all accounts, she was special. She was exceptionally smart. She studied at the university in Kovna at a time when many women didn't complete high school. She had a degree in natural sciences, and she taught at a Hebrew high school. She was fluent in at least 7 languages, and she could communicate in many others. She was learned, gregarious, a member of a loving family. So this is a family photo of my mother as a teenager with her parents and her younger siblings. They lived in Malat, which was a small town in Lithuania, where her parents had a bakery and a restaurant. And she also had an older brother, Jaime, who migrated to South Africa in 1926 before the war. In 1937, my mother married Moses Klompus, and a year later they had a son, Michael. They lived a relatively normal life in Kovna, which was the capital of Lithuania. And in 1940, Lithuania was invaded by Russia, and they signed a non-aggression pact between Russia and Germany. And as a result of this document, the Lithuanian Jewry had a false sense of security, despite the fact that Germany was having a huge impact in other parts of Europe. People were actually coming to Lithuania as refugees because they felt that it was safe. And then her world changed on the 22nd of June 1941 when Germany invaded Lithuania. Everything changed. These are her words. You can imagine we were sitting peacefully on a Sunday, sunny Sunday morning in June, and because Russia and Germany have got a non-aggression pact and Lithuania is ruled by Russia, we think we are quite safe. But then we see at about 12 o'clock in the morning, German planes attacking Kovna, which was the capital of Lithuania. Bombs were all the time just booming. That is all that we heard. And from that very minute, we could already not get out into the street because we were straight away arrested or taken away to be shot. From this moment, all the Jews in Lithuania ceased to be normal members of the country where they had been born, where they had lived and worked and identified as citizens. Many of them were murdered by their Lithuanian neighbors and the German forces in the first few days of occupation. Those who survived this initial onslaught were forced into the ghetto, where every liberty was curtailed. The Kovna ghetto was a suburb designed for 8,000 people, and it became home to 30,000 Jews. There were electrified fences, unbearably cramped conditions, forced labor, constant hunger, deprivation of any freedom of choice. And the Nazis controlled the ghetto via the Judenrat. Despite this, my mother and her husband and child and her mother-in-law remained in the ghetto as a family for 15 months. And they considered themselves lucky. They had a little bit of work, they were together. Against all odds, they survived the selections and the hunger and the brutality. And then in October 1942, the Nazi authorities issued a demand for 2,000 men from the ghetto to be sent to Estonia. And the Judenrat provided a list, and my mother's husband's name was on it. There was also an offer for the men's families to go with them if they agreed. They were promised that if they went with, they could continue to live together as a family. And after much agonizing and deliberation, my mother decided to go with her husband and child and mother-in-law to Estonia as a family. But of course, it was a cruel Nazi hoax. And as soon as they reached the station, the family was separated. My mother was sent to one concentration camp in Estonia, her husband to another, her not quite 5-year-old son and his grandmother were sent to Auschwitz, and my mother never saw them again. My mum spent almost 3 years in 5 different concentration camps. These were Vivera, Erida, and Lagedi, all in Estonia. And then she was transferred to Stutthof in Germany, and she went to a camp in Ochsenzoll, which was an offshoot of the infamous women's camp Ravensbrück, close to Hamburg. And finally, she went to Bergen-Belsen. She was liberated on the 15th of April 1945 in Bergen-Belsen by the Allied forces. This information that I've just given you is described in this document I found entitled The Story of My Life. It's dated the 14th of February 1946, written 10 months after liberation while she was living and working in Bergen-Belsen displaced persons camp. I find it particularly heartbreaking that my amazingly accomplished mother saw her life at that moment in time in terms only of the horrors she had endured and how much she had lost. But then when you looked at her experience, you could understand all of that. The first concentration camp she went to was Vivera in Estonia. And in Vivera, she worked in the barracks, having to clean the squalid living quarters of 100 women who shared 20 bunks. And they were locked in overnight with no toilet facilities. Every morning, the Kapo would come to collect 60 or 70 of the women from the barracks for forced labor, and he would frequently beat them when they wouldn't comply. My mum couldn't stand the brutality, and she quickly devised a plan. She approached him and offered to organize the work groups for him on condition that he wouldn't assault the women. And then she got the women together and they agreed to a roster system that she set up, enabling the very young and the very old not to go out to work, and ensuring that the others took turns to have a day off. And it worked. There was a compliant workforce, and the most vulnerable people remained in the barracks and recuperated. The camp leader took note of her skills, and she earned his grudging respect, and she also gained a little bargaining power. But more importantly, she gained the love and trust of the women in the barracks. And step by step, she succeeded in taking some control of an untenable situation and making it a little better for everyone. The women who remained in the barracks each day helped with the cleaning. My mom established a relationship with the kitchen staff so she could access some coal and some wood, and so the barrack was a little warmer when the women came back from work and there was hot water to drink. My mother explained to me that she believed that survival was due mostly to chance. She estimated that this accounted for maybe 90% of survival. But the other 10%, what you did with the chance you were given, was up to you. And I believe after the initial devastation of being separated from her family and the incredible dehumanization and humiliation that she endured, her resilience began to emerge, and she began to influence that 10%. She had innate strength. She used her skills to help others to survive as well. She was brave. She was not afraid to confront authority. And her ability to converse with her captors in their own language gave her a subliminal advantage. Early on, she also recognized the importance of connectedness. She instinctively knew that friendship and belonging helped to overcome the dehumanization that the Nazis were trying to perpetuate. So during her time in the camps, she gathered around her a group of about 10 younger women who became her friends. More than her friends, they became her daughters. She talked about them as her girls or her adopted daughters. And they all looked out for each other, and they made sacrifices for each other, and they survived together until the end. She said, we were mostly from Kovna, from Lithuania, our group. We were all the time a whole group, always standing together, and this helped us a lot. We came from one place, so we had the same schooling, we had the Hebrew language, all of us, and whenever we had a chance, we were just sitting and telling each other stories. Stories about what we'd studied or stories from home, trying not to forget who and what we are. And this is a photograph of my mother and her adopted daughters taken at Bergen-Belsen 10 months after liberation, where they had all survived together. This photograph is an incredible gift that they made for her. It's a handmade book. Each page is a handwritten tribute to her from one of her girls, and they gave her this book on her birthday, the 5th of July, 1945. The cover of the book is made from a Canadian Air Force uniform, and the inside cover is adorned with pressed and fabric flowers. And it's amazing evidence of the role she played in their lives. Now, at this point in time, I want to tell you 3 short stories, 3 incidents that illustrated the importance of this incredible relationship that they all shared. One of her girls was just a young teenager, and she was smaller and frailer than the others. And she struggled to make it through the 24 hours between one meager meal and the next. Each day, they received 1 slice of bread and some brown soup or water or something. And as the day wore on, this young teenager would faint from hunger. Now, any evidence of weakness was perceived by the Nazi leadership as evidence that somebody was no longer capable of working, and almost inevitably led to them being sent for extermination. And my mum knew it. So she knew that if this teenager's fainting was ever observed, she would almost certainly be sent to Auschwitz. So she gathered the others in the group, and she arranged for each of them to retain a little bit of their slice of bread so that during the day they could give it to this girl to stop her from fainting. Can you imagine the selflessness for someone who got 1 slice of bread in 24 hours to be willing to share it with someone who needed it more? But they did. And because of her amazing generosity, this little girl survived. The second story illustrates the same incredible generosity. And this was to somebody that was outside of the group. When they were in Stutthof, which was a staging point before they moved to a new concentration camp, they noticed a small group of women had been pulled to the side and were awaiting deportation. And the lady who was looking after them was speaking Russian, which my mother could understand. And she explained to the guards that she would guard these people until the next morning, and then they would be picked up for transportation to Auschwitz. And among the group was a very young girl. My mum said she looked like she was 10 years old. And they couldn't stand the thought that this poor little girl was going to be deported the next morning. And so they made a plan. Some of them still had something hidden, a chain or a watch or some money, and somebody had a wedding ring, and they decided to put it all together into a parcel. And my mum approached the woman, speaking Russian, and told her what she would give her if they would take the girl out for them. And she did. She brought the little girl to them, and they paid her with what they had. And this little girl, they took back to the barracks and they hid her. And her name was Chayla. And she wasn't so little, she was actually 14, but she looked like she was 10. And until the end of the camps, she remained with my mom and became her adopted daughter. And the lovely rider to this story is that a couple of weeks ago, my daughter managed to find Chaela's daughter who lives in New York. Sorry, that's a very emotional component. Okay. The third story shows the reciprocal nature of the relationship. So in this story, my mother's life was saved by the actions of her daughters. After she'd been in Vibara for a short time, she became ill with typhus, and she was sent to a so-called medical facility. This in itself was a miracle, since most of the inmates of the camps who became ill were sent to Auschwitz. But she had earned the respect of the Nazi camp leader, and he ordered that she at least be given a chance to recover. So she went to this medical facility where there was no medical care, but there was a daily visit from a Jewish doctor and nurse. And as luck would have it, the nurse was one of her daughters. So she had contact with what was happening in the main camp. And most people died in that facility, but my mother somehow recovered. However, before she was well enough to leave the medical facility, the camp was closed to avoid the approaching Russian army, and the staff and occupants were ordered to move to a new camp. But they had no intention of taking their sick with them. They simply wrapped them up naked in blankets and threw them out into the snow and left them. And the guards marched off to join everybody else leaving. There was no way she could have got up and left. She had no clothing. She was getting better, but she couldn't walk. She couldn't stand. And then her friends arrived, and great personal risk, 2 of them came to find her, bringing clothes with them, and they dressed her and they dragged her between them to the place where the rest of the camp had been assembled for transfer to a new location. And they slipped her into the line with the healthy inmates supporting her, so it looked as if she was marching. And the nurse had a key to a carriage on the train that had medical furniture, and she pushed her in and locked her in, and in this way she survived. So against all odds, thanks to their actions, she got to the next camp. Finally, on the 15th of April 1945, Bergen-Belsen was liberated by the Allied forces. After liberation, my mother remained in Bergen-Belsen displaced persons camp for almost a year, working first as secretary to the commanding officer of Bergen-Belsen, and later she established and ran a kosher kitchen with a few of her adopted daughters for about 300 women who remained in Bergen-Belsen and wanted to eat kosher food. And there was relative security for her in the displaced persons camp. She had the support network of her adopted daughters, but she realized she needed to start her life again. The transition was extremely difficult. I found these words written among her journals. She said, "We were unexpectedly free. We had survived. We were reborn a second time, orphans, alone in a strange world. We had to learn to fit into a new society, to adapt to a strange way of life. We tried extremely hard to pick up the broken threads of our lives. We adjusted to the demands of the new environments and new ways of life, but we could never be like you. We are different, and our inner world is different. We are forever burdened by personal horrendous memories that are continually recalled to mind. This abnormal is our normal, and it never goes away." She had lost everyone and everything: her parents, her siblings, her husband, her child, her mother-in-law, her friends, her home, her possessions. But she never lost the essence of who she was. She retained her humanity and her morality throughout that time, and she survived. And then she went on to rebuild her life and live it to the full with an amazing sense of optimism and determination. After 10 months in the displaced persons camp, she was ready to move forward. She had traveled to Europe for a short time looking for her husband, hoping against hope that he was alive, but she eventually had to accept that he had not survived. She looked at various options for her future. There was an illegal immigration to Israel that appealed to her sense of Zionism. She had family in the United States who reached out to her, but eventually she decided to join her older brother in South Africa. At the time, South Africa was not accepting Holocaust survivors, but she had a cousin who was an influential lawyer there, and he managed to arrange a temporary visa for her, and she was the first survivor to arrive in South Africa. Shortly after arriving in South Africa, after an initial physical and mental breakdown where she spent 3 months in hospital, her resilience resurfaced. She enrolled for university. She got a job. She rented an apartment on her own. She met my father, who she married in April 1948, 2 years after arriving in South Africa. She went back to university and studied, attaining 4 more degrees over her lifetime, the last being a PhD in Holocaust literature at the age of 73. And she had 2 daughters, my sister and me. And in time, she had 5 adored grandchildren whose lives she influenced profoundly. My mum immigrated to Australia in 1990, and she lived in Sydney until she passed away in 2000 at the age of 86. But the central focus of her life remained the Holocaust. Despite building a new life for herself, her fundamental identity was that of a survivor. She justified her survival and her determination to live by a self-imposed obligation to share her experiences with everyone. And this remained the central force in her life. After my mum passed away in 2000, I found in her apartment a remarkable collection of items, wonderful and important evidence of her incredible life. There were amazing documents from the time of her liberation from Bergen-Belsen, newspaper articles of her university achievements, photographs, writings, lecture notes, audio interviews, video interviews. She was an avid educator, taking every opportunity to talk about the Holocaust to whoever would listen. She gave countless interviews. She was a guide at Holocaust museums in South Africa and Australia, and a living historian in numerous school programs. She immersed herself in Holocaust studies, trying to make logical sense of this inexplicable trauma. My mum truly embodied the Holocaust experience, physically, emotionally, and academically. She had always spoken openly about her experiences, and as her children, we were always aware of her loss and of her sad past. We absorbed her experiences through all our senses into the core of our beings. Her past, our heritage, was always chillingly there. But it was only 6 years ago, 15 years after her death, when I began to really listen to the many interviews she had given over her life and read the documents that related not only to her Holocaust experiences, but also her active involvement in Holocaust education for the remainder of her life. And only then was I truly appreciative of how exceptional she was. I became awestruck by her resilience, by her incredible belief in what was important, stunned by her sense of morality that dictated her decision-making, and her tenacity to ensure that this dark chapter in history would never be rewritten by Holocaust denialists. She said, I think that my survival has something to do with the mission that I have to perpetuate the memory of the Holocaust, to perpetuate the memory of 6 million Jews that were innocently murdered, cut down in the middle of their lives. And as I worked through her writings and I listened to her words, the essence of my mother crystallized. And her mission to perpetuate the memory became my mission too. And so the book, the story of my mother's amazing life and passion, was born. I guess by now you're starting to get a sense of the person my mother was. I could go on for hours, telling you of her amazing attributes, her bravery, her courage, her loyalty, her interest in coping skills, her empathy towards other people, her incredible sense of self, that stubborn determination to live against all odds, but always in the context of morality, never at the cost of another human being. I could tell you of her amazing pragmatism and her enduring optimism, but we've run out of time. So let me leave you with a quote that depicts, in my eyes, the hero that my mother was. The amazing woman who was not just a survivor, but so much more. She said, every hour of our life, to live an extra hour under these circumstances, this was courage. This was heroism. We couldn't do anything to our murderers, to our enemies, but at least we tried to defy them by trying to want to live. In my eyes, she will always be that hero. Someone who, despite all odds, rekindled the flame of her present from the ashes of her past, instilled in us the need to share this flame from generation to generation for the hopes of our collective future. Thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miller. And if you would close the screen share, then we can all look at each other in the gallery view, perhaps. And what a touching and remarkable story of a person who managed to save their humanity in unbelievably inhumane circumstances. I'd like to open it up to questions. If people want to raise your hand physically or raise your hand with the reactions, put a question in the comment. Yes, Dr. Moog.
You need to unmute yourself.
Rochy, that was, again, this is the second time I've seen a presentation. It again blew me away. It's hard not to get tearful during such a presentation. I remember when Rochy first told me that she was writing this book, I was utterly blown away because I just realized the importance of what she's doing to keep the memory alive. I mean, we've seen some of these numbers, how a relatively small number of high school students here in America don't even know what the Holocaust is. So the work that she's doing to re-educate the newer generation, the importance of reminding people of never again, the importance of pointing out the evils of hate and racism and anti-Semitism, and spreading the word and making it educational the way she's already doing, making it part of her life's work. This is such important work. And I know she's on a roll. She's continuing to do this. And maybe some of us should spread the word about making this educational in Arizona or in other states as well. And, you know, the importance of this, we have a responsibility and obligation to keep this memory alive big time. I too lost a sizable number of family when Hitler invaded Poland in 1939. So I relate to this huge, as I'm sure all of you do. Rochy, thanks very much. This was magnificent and fabulous work. Mazel tov, great work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you, I see Sam Klein. Sam Klein is a Holocaust educator at Temple High. So thank you for joining us, Sam, and please.
It's not only the high school students who don't know anything about it. According to surveys, 40% of American adults don't know anything about it. A large percent millennials, many cannot, and many adults cannot name one concentration camp or ghetto. I also think it's very important that the work and the education of the kids continue, and also that, you know, that they also have to know that the Jews did fight back in every place that they could.
I think that for me, the Holocaust Center in Florida, who've been promoting what I'm doing and helping me, have got a fantastic education program. And I think that we need to give credit to all the Holocaust centers in the various states, because that's the source that people come to if they're looking for education. And somebody has to just rally the school system to get them to access the Holocaust centers. It's not that the information's not there, it's there. America has more information than anywhere else in the world. It's just that you need to make people want to go and look for it.
There's also the Springer Institute in Flagstaff that puts out a lot of material and programs about the Holocaust to teach adults who are involved in the teaching. Many of the programs that I go to are basically for those high school teachers who have the classes for a while. I'm limited to 1 day a week, 40 minutes per class. I've got years of materials to teach, but I try to jam as much as I could while still keeping the kids interested in it.
We have a fantastic program that Alan touched on here. It's called Courage to Care. And it's a program where we go into the schools, and it's a 1.5 hour program. So for the first half an hour, we have somebody introduce the concept of the Holocaust and the concept of an upstander. And then the second half an hour, we have a Holocaust survivor or somebody like myself who tells the story. And then the third half an hour, we have facilitators who put the children into small groups, and they discuss the impact of what they've heard and how they can use that not only for, against Holocaust happening, but how they can use that in their everyday life to move from being a bystander to an upstander. And we only run it for 10 weeks of the year, and it is a really amazing program. We go by invitation. The schools book a year in advance, and it's run by volunteers. So and I know the Holocaust Center in Florida is starting to do something similar, which they're talking about as their upstander program. So there's such a lot of resources and so many facilities. We just have to tap into them.
Yes, and Sam, we really are so grateful for everything that you do with our students in our own religious school to educate them and to keep the memory alive. And I love that bystander to upstander. It's such an important message. Dr. Miller, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your mom's religious life. Did she grow up in a religious home? And for so many survivors, we know that their experience was such an affront to their faith that they came away no longer participating in religious life. What was your mom's journey?
My mom grew up in a religious home, kosher, observant, Orthodox home. And her whole life, she kept a kosher home, and she was observant. But after the Holocaust, she told us for many, many, many years that she didn't believe in a God. The only way she could comprehend that a God had done this was to believe he didn't exist. And I remember, it didn't stop her practicing the traditions of her religion. And I said to her one day, my mother would go to shul every Friday night. She kept kosher. She would rather die than eat unkosher food. And I said to her one day, who are you praying to? You're sitting in synagogue with a prayer book, you're saying the prayers, and you're telling me you don't believe who you're praying to. Why are you doing it? And her reply was that she was honoring her parents. She said to me, could you go to sleep in a bed with no sheets? So to me, keeping kosher is having a bed with sheets. It's my comfort, it's my background, it's my tradition, and I honor my parents in this way. But my mother dealt with everything in life by studying. It was her way of dealing with everything. She went to multiple shiurim. She had many, many friends who were rabbis. She studied the Holocaust academically through university, and her supervisor for her PhD was Rabbi Rappaport, who was a friend of hers. And she would go to the shiurim and she'd argue, and it wasn't belligerence, it was a need to come to terms with this in her head. And just before she died, she had a brain tumor and she was in hospital for 2 months. And her rabbi, who was her friend from Sydney, came to Brisbane where she was in hospital to visit her and spent the day with her. And when he left, he said to me, your mum's actually come to terms with this whole, somewhere, it wasn't me, but somewhere in this discussion we've had now, I can tell you that she's come to terms with the fact that there is a God and she has made peace with him. So, it was a denial of a God because she needed that to be able to understand how he could have done what he did. But it wasn't from a position of, I don't want to know. It was from a position of, I want to know, explain it to me. And one of the lovely things at the commemoration of her tombstone was the rabbi who had been the leader of her shiurim gave a speech, and he said, I know where Lea is tonight. She's sitting near to God, and I hope she's asking all the questions I couldn't answer.
Well, so many beautiful Jewish values evidenced in her story, the value of learning and the value of questioning and honoring parents, and what an amazing legacy. Other questions? Well, I want to thank Dr. Moak for introducing us to Dr. Miller. Dr. Miller, thank you so much for joining us. I will make the recording of this session available so that we can share it more broadly and keep your mother's blessed memory alive, and the events of the Shoah in the forefront of the consciousness of our people.
Thank you so much for this amazing opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you for being here. Thanks to every one of you. Yes, Dr. Moak, final words? Okay.
I thank you, Rabbi Capel, for allowing me to introduce Rochy group, and at a time with Yom HaShoah as it is, this is just to me an amazing book, an amazing memory that needs to be kept alive. The ongoing education, and you have it. There you go. All right.
It's actually available from the Holocaust Museum in Arizona that you talked about, Sam. I gave them copies of it a little while ago so that they can at least benefit from the proceeds. It's available on Amazon as well. But if you're looking to buy it, I'd be very happy that you bought it from the Holocaust Museum so they could at least benefit from it.
Yes, and if any local folks would like to borrow it, I have it available. All right, everyone, take good care.
Thanks, guys.
For joining us.